On the 9th of September, the Group 2 Doncaster Cup, one of the most historic races in the world, will take centre stage during the Ladbrokes St Leger Festival, 250 years after it was first run in this South Yorkshire town.
The anchor is going to win the Doncaster Cup, a spirited late burst by Kurt Cocker, but he won't get there. At the line, Sea Anchor is the winner.
One of the most celebrated winners of the Doncaster Cup in the mid-1800s was the great Voltigeur, who came up against the Flying Dutchman, unbeaten in 13 previous races. But it was Voltigeur, ridden by Nat Flatman for trainer Robert Hill, who got his head in front. That victory was made all the more remarkable by the fact that just 2 days earlier, Voltigeur had contested the St Leger. He dead-heated with a horse called Rusborough, but because connections weren't happy with the judge's verdict, the race had to be rerun just 2 hours later. Voltigeur, clearly tired from those exertions, stepped back on the track but got his head in front to win the classic. Over the centuries, this great race has been won by some of the most famous thoroughbreds in history, including Voltigeur, Brown Jack and Bees Wing, whose 4 wins in the mid-1800s remain a record to this very day.
But first round, he's going to make all the running. He's going to hold on from Hardross, and coming to the line, Lamas wins the Stayers Treble for the 2nd year running.
For the first 10 years, the Doncaster Gold Cup, as it was known back then, was run here at Cantley Common, just a stone's throw away from the racecourse at Town Moor. This was a full decade before the first ever running of the St Leger. Back then, the Doncaster Gold Cup was run over a demanding 4 miles.
Then Hunt Dancer, but there's only one horse, the bravest horse, Persian Hunt.
By the time legendary trainer John Scott won the first of his 5 Doncaster Cups in 1835, the race was firmly established here on Town Moor. Scott trained from the historic Whitewall stables in Malton. Now, Scott's most famous horse in the 1830s was a horse called Touchstone, who won the Doncaster Cup in 1835 and again in 1836. But the horse endured quite an adventure en route to Whitewall stables to join Scott. The groom responsible for bringing the horse up from the south called off at an inn en route, had a few too many to drink, and promptly lost the horse into the wild. Now, he was found a few days later in a dreadful state near Sheffield, but of course eventually came back here to Scott and was commissioned to win those 2 Doncaster Cups. He was unbeaten as a 5-year-old, and in winning the great race at Doncaster, managed to lower the colours of that legendary race mare, Bees Wing, who won the race herself on 4 separate occasions. Mark, you've been here at Whitewall for about 15 years, but you can really taste the history around this place.
Yes, when we came here, we were really delighted to be able to get involved with such a famous and historic stables.
And it's remarkable, isn't it, just how many classic winners were trained from here. This really was one of the leading stables in the whole country.
I believe it was 40 classic winners. And John Scott would have been very much the man of the moment.
And you look around the place and it almost takes you back to that time in the early 1800s. So little has changed. It is, of course, a Grade 2 listed building, so you've not been able to change an awful lot in recent times. Well, not that you'd want to, of course.
We wouldn't do. There are a lot of period features which are very typical of that period. But the way it was constructed, it was built to last.
Back in the early 1800s, I take it John Scott would have taken his horses over to the Malton Gallops to work them.
Langton Well Gallops, they would have worked there, but they would have had to have walked all the way to Doncaster or to Epsom, which is a feature that we don't really sort of doesn't spring to mind, and it wasn't until later on in the 18th century that horses were taken in a horse box, essentially a wagon, a very sort of basic fundamental wagon that would have been drawn by probably 6 other horses, and that was considered to be the state-of-the-art horse transport. And then, of course, beyond that, then the railways came into place, so the horses could get to the races in a train, on a train.
Back in those days, they were incredibly resilient animals, weren't they?
Hardy, really hardy horses. A horse would have to be able to, let's say, walk from one end of the country to the other, and I've no doubt that there were satellite yards that John Scott used at, let's say, Doncaster or further down in Surrey, sort of in the Epsom, Guildford, Leatherhead sort of area, some satellite yards where the horses would have stayed and rented gallops as well to fine-tune the horse, so he could have a blow just before those classics that were won.
Whilst its history is rooted in Doncaster, Newmarket is also synonymous with the Doncaster Cup. Jockey Doug Smith won it 4 years in a row after the war, and no trainers have enjoyed more success than Cecil Boyd Rochford and his stepson, the late Sir Henry Cecil. And it was here at Palace House Stables in Newmarket, now part of the National Heritage Centre, that the great Jack Jarvis trained in the first half of the last century. Jarvis won the Doncaster Cup in 1922 with Devisers, in 1926 with Bon Grace, and again in 1932 with Fox Hunter, ridden by the legendary Sir Gordon Richards. We're looking at a set of scales that belonged to the late Sir Gordon Richards.
They did. He was renowned for being concerned about his weight. He did weigh himself twice a day, and these are the scales that he was using. And the success he had in looking after his weight was in about 1930 he weighed 7 stone 5, and his lowest weight after that was about 7 stone 8. And his riding weight around 1953, when he retired, had gone up to 8 stone 5. It was naturally short, and it was obviously easy for him to control his weight. But a jockey does become obsessive. They have to be concerned about their weight. And here is a fantastic example in the museum's collection of to demonstrate exactly how important weight control is for the jockey.
Isn't it fascinating how the jockey's whip has changed over the years? The exhibit you've got here is very much like the one that Gordon Richards would have carried to victory in the Doncaster Cup in 1932.
Yes, I think so. And one of the things that we have with a whip of this kind is how thin it is, and compare that with the whips that are now being used by the jockeys, and more care and concern being expressed for animal welfare. So these whips were phased out after the war, and we now have the more modern whips that protect the horse.
Very much like the jockey's helmet has changed as well since the 1930s.
The jockey's helmet and the back protectors, and much more concern for jockeys' welfare in terms of diet and exactly what they're eating to control their weight. In the past, they would have used a lot of purgatives, which really do debilitate the body. I think more care, more science going into jockey welfare is one of the things that the new museum will be concentrating on.
We mentioned Jack Jarvis, who did also train a few winners of the Doncaster Cup, and he was a real sporting superstar, wasn't he, of his era. Trained at Palace House. He also trained at a couple of other sites in town, Warren House and Park Lodge, and here he is pictured on the front of a sporting magazine back in the day.
Jack Jarvis is important to us in the new museum because he was training at Palace House. He trained there from 1950 through to 1965. He really used it as a second stable from his main stable at Park Lodge, but a very important racing family, and I think just seeing one of the most important magazines of the pre-war period featuring the Derby favourite on the cover. Here we've got Blue Peter, a horse denied his real fame because he won the 2,000 guineas and the Derby, but was denied his opportunity in the St Leger because of the outbreak of war. Meant that the race was cancelled. One of his major enthusiasms was coursing, and he established the Newmarket Coursing Club out at 6 Mile Bottom, and one can imagine him using this while he's watching the greyhounds coursing in the 1920s.
Over the centuries, there have been many different trophies and cups for the Doncaster Cup, which remains to this day the longest perpetual race.
Yes, it's the Doncaster Cup is the longest continuously run race on a racecourse with the very same conditions or very similar conditions to the way that it started. It started out as a 4-mile race and it's obviously shorter now, but the basic conditions to prove staying horses or a good trophy for staying horses is still what the Doncaster Cup is.